Collins with Cullman Today. I'm out with Senator Bussman. You've just completed week 3, Senator. A lot of good things happened for you. Before we get into the good part, let's talk about the Senate bill, which is the Judicial Override. It sounds kind of technical and arcane, but it's really important, isn't it?
It's very important. In the state of Alabama, if a jury decides somebody to have life in prison without parole, the judge can on his own convert that to the death penalty. And that has been a situation that, to me, is a very big concern. You have a trial of your peers, you have a trial in your community of the people that are around you, and when they have enough doubt not to apply the death penalty, then I think it's inappropriate for a judge to turn around and then apply the death penalty. So this week we passed a bill out of the Senate that would prevent that from happening anymore. And I think that's a tremendous bill. I think it's good for the judicial system. I think it's good for fairness in Alabama.
Well, I've noticed, and I don't know if there's any documentation on this, but some of those sentences that are converted to a death penalty tend to occur, seems to me, around election season.
Well, there was documentation of that. We saw some numbers where there was an uptick in those type of sentences during an election cycle, and we never, under any circumstance, want to have an election affect the life of an individual. I mean, if we're going to put somebody to death, I mean that is a major step, and it needs to be 100% that they're guaranteed that person did what they said he did.
Well, there's one person who's been incarcerated. It's a fairly famous story around the state who had judicial override, and he'd been sentenced to death. He wouldn't be where he's at today. You're thinking about some changes in that area, aren't you?
I have. Many of you know Anthony Ray Hinton. You've probably seen the story. The man was on death row for 30 years. When you look at his story, the protection he had under the system, I think, failed him. He had very poor legal counsel, and he was convicted. And as of last year, the Supreme Court forced the state to go back and relook at those charges, and they were unwilling to go through another trial. And so he finally came out and is now a free man. And I think at this point, if somebody is wrongfully incarcerated, we have the opportunity in the state of Alabama to compensate that person. And so this week I dropped a bill that would do exactly that. It would compensate Mr. Hinton for 30 years of sitting on death row and most likely being innocent.
That'll be precedent setting.
It'll generate some interest. Let's put it like that. But I think bottom line is this man's been sitting in a 5x7 jail cell for 30 years since he was an older teenager. Any of us can imagine 30 years, from 19 to 49. What kind of effect that would have on your life and the things that you missed. And I just think it's a situation where we have all these racial issues now, and we have all these issues amongst people. It's time that we started doing things to improve that situation and to show reasonable concern when we think there's been something that's not been done correctly.
Well, that's profound, and I think you're right. You're going to see a lot of activity around that. Yet another success is for homeschoolers and qualifying for police academy. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, in the state of Alabama, a child cannot get in, or a person cannot get in the police academy without having a GED or a state school board approved diploma. And this completely left out the homeschool community. It completely left out the parochial schools. It completely left out the religious schools and the private schools. And so right now, we passed a bill that would allow them to get into the police academy just like they do in the fire academy. And so our goal is to open that door of opportunity so people can get employed in that position. It passed the Senate this week, and we're cautiously optimistic it'll go through the House pretty quickly.
That's a good deal for everybody. I think there's going to be some happy folks when that becomes law.
Well, I just think everybody ought to have the same opportunities, and many of our homeschoolers, are very intelligent, and to make them spend a couple $100 to go back and take a GED test is just not fair.
Makes sense. Let's switch from school to food. The governor seems insistent upon reducing taxes for those of us who buy groceries, which is everybody. There's pros and cons there, isn't there?
There's a lot of pros and cons. The pro is that we shouldn't charge people for food. We shouldn't tax people on food. But the con side of it is that many people that are avoiding paying taxes, that is the only tax they actually pay. And so there is a push and a shove in the Senate. Do we eliminate the grocery tax or do we not eliminate the grocery tax? And so it's going to be interesting to see how that works out. I think that we've got to be very careful in how we do this so we don't compromise the budgets of the state, which are already tight. And all of that money goes to education. And if it goes to education and you're talking about taking that several $1 million a year out of the education, then that is something we've really got to look at very hard.
Well, it's odd because it makes no sense with all the other concerns you've talked to me about over the last 2 years with the budget. If we have a tax in place that is working and is not that penal, that's a lot of money every month.
Right, and it is a lot of money. And when our property taxes are very low, other people say they don't have the grocery tax, but if you look at their property tax, the property tax is sky high. And so there's a trade-off, and right now Alabama chooses the grocery tax as opposed to trying to collect additional property taxes. And so any of these things we've got to look at anytime you're talking about cutting revenue, anytime you're talking about budgets, and especially in the education side. That is really a concern of mine, that we don't put our schools in any worse condition than they are already.
Now, there's been lots of activity in the Senate. I'm sure you've seen things go across your desk that I don't know about. What should we know that's happening now that we're deeper into the session?
Well, the one thing that popped up this week is the Parking Deck Authority. The Parking Deck Authority has come to us and asked for a $28 million bond issue to build a new parking deck at the State House. And to me, that's a very concerning thing. We go out and we tell people we've got financial problems and we've got all these issues that we're dealing with, and all of a sudden we pop up with a $28 million parking authority, or we pop up with an $800 million prison system renovation. We just can't continue to borrow and borrow and borrow. We've got to live within our means. They do have the money, I think, that is already appropriated that could do that parking deck. We don't need to bond out any more money. We found out this week that some of these departments have money that we didn't even know about. One in particular is an agency that oversees the Capitol and the State House, has $15 million sitting in a fund that is just not doing anything. And so we're going to look at those numbers before we start borrowing any money.
Well, I'd like a swimming pool in my backyard, but I don't think I'm really able to afford it this year.
Well, if you're the state of Alabama, you can just evidently just keep borrowing and borrowing and borrowing, and as individuals, we can't do that. At some point, you're gonna hit the wall, and you're gonna say you can't borrow anymore. But evidently, the state of Alabama can borrow what it chooses to borrow, and if we tie enough taxes to it, I guess we can pay for it. But that is a terrible way to run government.
Yeah, I can't imagine we need a parking deck. Anything else?
That's pretty much it this time. We're seeing some tax credits. The budgets are going to start moving next week. We should start seeing more input on the prison system. That has been kind of very slow moving forward. And those things are going to be big issues before we get done. And we in the Senate have to deal with the education budget first. And so most of our focus right now is that and making sure our schools are funded and they have what they need to educate our kids.
Senator, thank you for talking about week 3. It's very fascinating if it's not complicated. We'll be back next week for week 4. Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.